new economy ideally is for everyone, but more realistically speaking, it's for people who know how to adapt and how to change.
These lower skilled jobs are going to be overcome by digital factors. So I think it's going to be an interesting question of how the younger generation and future consumers are going to react to this next level.
It is essential for countries to keep on investing in education because it's the base of the economy.
Moving forward, we will see more of these kinds of positions open up, where it isn't as much about a set job that you're given, it's more about what you create.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome. A few young people talking about the future of work, what they think about the jobs of the future. It's a theme we're going to pick away at now. For those of you who weren't here yesterday, or indeed at recent St. Gallen's, I'm Stephen Sackur, the presenter of HARDtalk. It's great to be with you again. But much more important, we have got a fabulous guest for this one-on-one session. Hands over, who remembers a time when Washington politics was calm and serene and didn't involve Donald Trump? It's kind of tough sometimes, remember. It did actually happen that there was a White House that functioned without firing at least one person a day. And central to the last White House that appeared to function relatively rationally was this man with me. So please give a warm, a very, very warm welcome to Barack Obama's Chief of Staff through the entirety of his second term, a guy who I think it's fair to say is one of the closest associates, friends, and colleagues of the former president. Warm welcome to Denis McDonough. Now, Denis obviously left the White House a while ago. He does various things now for the Carnegie Endowment, for the Markle Foundation. Who knew Meghan Markle had a foundation? Yeah. That's extraordinary. Presumably most of your work is about the Harry-Meghan marriage at the moment.
Well, this is a different Markle.
A different Markle, okay. So Denis has two key interests right now that he's working on both nationally and internationally. One is refugees, which is fascinating, and we might touch upon it when it comes to the world of work and the factors that go into what we might expect to see, changing patterns, which include migration patterns when it comes to the 21st century in the world of work. But much more particularly, Denis is also doing an awful lot of work on the questions that St. Gallen's all about this year, which is, what do we define as work? How is technology changing the world of work and the workplace? And what is going to happen to particularly the futures of young people who are perhaps entering the workplace now or expecting to over the next few years, including, my kids, his kids, all of us in this room who've got kids. We need to be thinking about what the economy is going to offer them. So let us start by reflecting, if we can, Denis, on actually the interface of politics and these sorts of deep-seated economic changes. It does intrigue me that in the 2016 election, which produced Donald Trump as president, what we saw were a huge number of workers in the United States, and let's generalize a little bit and say particularly blue-collar, white American workers who seemed to be so consumed with economic insecurity and anxiety and did not feel that the politics of Barack Obama and indeed the Democratic Party and Hillary Clinton spoke to them and offered them a sense that you had solutions to their problems. Why do you think that was?
Well, Stephen, thanks for the nice introduction, and it's really great to be with everybody. It's been a really fascinating day plus that I've been here with you, so thanks for that. Look, I think, as we were just discussing, we can't overlearn the lesson of 2016 as just about 2016. We have to witness that we've, as an economy, experienced now decades of productivity stagnation, decades of, therefore, wage stagnation that is leading, in light of things like inflation for universities' fees, leading to a whole host of American workers and American voters who feel like the system is not working for them. This was obviously magnified by the depths of the recession in 2007 and 2008. And so if we don't take a long enough view of the nature of discontent among and anxiety among many of our workers, then we'll not have learned the right lessons. And that's why it's so important that St. Gallen is doing what it's doing with this conference, why everybody in the audience is doing what they're doing, because I do think this question about work, about automation, and about the dignity that people draw from work will be a significant issue in our politics in years to come, and I think we'll look back at 2016 as a time when that began to crystallize.
So how do you think the United States is doing right now, facing up to this challenge?
I think that in different places in the United States, really interesting things are happening. In Colorado, for example, where Governor Hickenlooper is doing a lot of very interesting things, you see an ecosystem, that is to say, job workers, employers, and trainers working together to try to reform how Colorado operates. So that's happening, I think, quite effectively there. There's other places, Rhode Island, places like South Dakota, Indiana. These are interesting experiments. On the national level, I don't think that this is getting near the attention or the urgent attention that it would otherwise demand given the enormity of the changes that we're on the verge of.
Interesting to me that when you talk about places where you see people fronting up and really taking on this challenge, you're talking about political leadership in Colorado, for example. But that does beg the question whether political leaders and the political process is central to delivering change, or should you, in the US, or maybe all of us around the world, be expecting this to sort of organically come from the private sector?
Look, I think that the private sector is going to be a principal actor here. There's no question about it, and I think you see that in a variety of ways. You see that in the context of employers being very clear about what we call the skills gap in the United States. There's still millions of jobs that are unfilled because employers can't find the skilled workers or the workers with the skills that they need. But it's not only going to be on employers. It's going to be a question of the whole ecosystem reforming. That is to say, universities, community colleges, and new entrants in the training and education field have to get more tied into employers so that the way they're skilling workers are actually attached to skills that are going to lead to jobs. And employers need to then be more precise about the kind of skills that they're looking for. Right now, overwhelmingly, the proxy that employers use in the United States to hire people is whether they have a bachelor's degree. Well, it's well over 60% of Americans don't have a bachelor's degree. It can't be that every job where we need a skilled worker is a job that requires a bachelor's degree. And so we have to get much more skilled about defining what it is we need, much more skilled about where it is that we can allow workers to get those skills, and then get some greater transparency in that labor market so we empower workers themselves to market themselves, to go out and look for places where their skills can be gainfully employed.
I mean, right now, we have political leadership in Washington that, I'm going to, again, generalize massively, but far from drilling down and focusing on skills shortages and what can be done to retrain people, to change the way young people are educated in terms of all of the skills that go from software engineering to people skills. What you have is a president who goes to West Virginia and says, you know, I'm going to revive the coal industry. He talks about turning the United States into the biggest oil producer in the world, and he talks about protectionism and building walls. Now, you know, we can't get away from the reality of Donald Trump. How worried are you that Trump-style politics is getting in the way of the transformation that you want to see?
Well, look, I've got worries about our politics. There's no question about that. But the thing that I'm hopeful about is that in the states and in major cities, we have governors and big city mayors who are very focused on the fact that employers in their states and in their cities are telling them, we don't have the skilled workers we need. They're closer to the action, they're closer to the need, they're closer to the pain points, and as a result, they're being more responsive. by the way, going back to your first question, Stephen, this is part of the problem that American voters witness, which is they feel anxiety, they are fundamentally optimistic people, but they see Washington not working. So it's not just a question of the bombast of any particular day. It's a question of whether the institutions themselves are even focused on the big questions. And you just don't see the kind of attention on artificial intelligence, on training, and on skills in Washington that one would expect to see given the enormity of this issue.
All right, I'm going to turn to questions from you guys in a minute because they're invariably better than mine. But before we get to the questions, let's just be interactive in a slightly different way. We've got one of these live vote questions or assessments of your opinion to put to you right now. If we can bring that up, here we go. Who should be the main actor in the task of addressing the skills gap in business resulting from automation? Many of the things that Dennis has just touched upon. So the main actor, the main driver, the public sector, the private sector, public-private partnerships with the public sector in the lead, or public-private partnerships with, the private sector in the lead, or NGOs. So I'm told you're all very good at this live voting caper. So do get on with it, and we'll at some point soon bring up a screen showing where opinion lies in the room.
I think we're going to do an analysis of voting age and turnout here. Yeah. And I expect a non-American turnout, which is to say I'd like to see a lot of young people voting in this.
Oh, well, the young people aren't slow at coming forward in this forum, so, and I'm going to encourage young people to ask you questions in just a moment. But I don't want to make this personal, or, well, yes, I do. Why am I lying? Let's get personal and political for a bit. What do you think you, to a certain extent, do you have regret that the Obama administration failed to deliver this message to the point where, you know, a lot of your natural, you would think, Democratic constituency actually thought that Donald Trump was going to offer them more in terms of job security, a better future for their kids, than you guys?
Look, I think that you're overstating the findings of the 2016 election. Barack Obama was not on the ballot.
No, but Hillary Clinton was, and you were a big supporter of hers too. And
yeah, I'm a proud supporter of hers, and I proudly voted for her. And but my point, though, Stephen, is the votes that you're talking about in a handful of states are a relatively small number of votes, right? That doesn't take away from the enormity of the question. And what I'm challenging policymakers and international opinion shapers like the people in this room is to not think that this is somehow a question that is one that came out of the 2016 election alone. This is a set of policy decisions that we've made over the course of the last several decades that end up impacting things like wages, productivity, free and open trade, open borders, and the extent to which we don't approach this with urgency and understand that perhaps we didn't handle globalization as delicately and as forthrightly as we might have. I think that should be a bit of advice to all of us.
And just in terms of priorities, I suppose, financial, political priorities. I think we heard from one panel earlier about the enormous focus in a country like South Korea on investment in R&D. Something I think between close to 5% of GDP goes into R&D. I think the numbers in the US is significantly lower.
It is.
How do you change that?
Well, look, you change it by being intentional about it, and this is something that President Obama sought in a series of successive budgets over 8 years to make sure that the federal investment in R&D was happening. And this is something that, for example, I think we should have done a better job, and I think there were alternatives to do a better job in the tax bill that was just passed earlier this year. And so there is a debate about these questions, and policymakers need to be intentional about it, and this is what I mean that right now there is not the degree of urgency around this at the federal level. However, the good news, that's the bad news. The good news is there is urgency around it, and there is experimentation going on in the states. And an outside-in strategy that goes to the states and uses the governors and the business leaders in those and labor leaders and educators in those states to pressure the federal government to move this up the priority list, that will work. And if we see this getting the kind of urgency that I think it should in the next national election in 2020, I think that will be a good sign about the United States reasserting its traditional leadership role on major economic questions like this one.
All right, well, never mind 2020, we've got results right now of our little poll.
That's what I'm talking about.
Let's bring up our results. So the winner, if I can put it that way, the most popular option is public-private sector partnerships with the public sector in the lead. Now, where would you have voted had you voted? You were too busy talking to me, but if you had a vote.
Look, I think I like that, but I think I like recognizing that there's got to be a partnership here. My principal observation is, and I think, you know, my column, one of the people I appeared with yesterday, Vishwa, made a very interesting point, which is public policy making in Washington at the moment, but I think across the world, is operating at a pretty slow speed. As against the speed and requirements of Moore's Law, that's insufficient. And so what we ought not to do is have opinion leaders, business leaders, waiting on the public sector to move. Pressuring the public sector to move, bringing them along makes sense. Waiting for them to lead, as you know, one could construe this question would be a mistake, and I'm happy to see that that's a generally well held view among the group.
Yeah. I had a fascinating workshop discussion yesterday led by Professor Guy Standing, an economist who is an advocate, number one, of a universal basic wage, which is a fascinating idea, and I might get your thoughts on that. But he's also been one of the chief sort of architects of a notion of a new class that has been generated by economic change, and he calls it the precariat. And the notion is that there is a real swathe of our population, not just in developed countries like the US and the UK, but frankly in most of the developing countries as well, a swathe of the population that is defined by uncertainty and economic anxiety, working on short-term contracts with none of the usual guarantees, pensions and holiday benefits and things like that, no indication of whether the job will exist in 6 months or a year's time, usually pretty poor conditions of work. And his conclusion is that this growth of the precariat is extraordinarily dangerous, because unless we address the needs of these people, it is highly likely that they will pursue the politics of anger and frustration. And, you know, that word populism pretty soon appears.
Yeah.
Do you share those concerns?
Look, I'd say two things. One is, I share the concern, but I flip the view a little bit, which is to say, rather than being fearful about it, I think we should be optimistic about all the opportunity that will come when we actually get back to a set of policies and priorities that get the best out of our people. This is a fundamental, looking at the skills gap and investing in reducing and fulfilling that skills gap with our workers is a fundamentally optimistic choice.
But the problem is, for a lot of stakeholders, big corporates, for example, the way things work now is kind of good. You know, they're making healthy profits. They have the ability to impose work conditions on their workers, which make them precarious, anxious, stressed, and uncertain, but deliver annual profits for shareholders. That's the nature of neoliberal capitalism.
Well, look, I'm not going to speak for them. There's plenty of them right here. Here's what I believe, and here's what I hear from business leaders is they're looking to manage risk. One of the big risks in the next 10 years is people. Well-trained people who can capitalize on the great opportunities that will come with this infusion of new technology, right? And that's a public policy gap that public sector can help fill by making sure that our workers are better trained so that this is not as big a question of risk for our business leaders. And that is a fundamentally optimistic question. It's not that we need to be fearful of this. We should be looking for how we optimize the performance of all of our workers. By the way, it's happened to have worked in the past. There's a reason that we are positioned in the West the way we're positioned. It's a combination of ingenuity and leadership and workers. And we ought to get back to that and not be afraid of the outcome, but rather see it as an opportunity. Point one. Point two, I heard Jeremy Rivkin talking this morning about his concept of stranded assets. Makes very sound sense. Governor Brown in California and the leader of his community colleges, a guy by the name of Eli Oakley, are approaching a different challenge, which is they call stranded workers. These are workers stranded in this economy because they don't feel they have the skills that they need to capitalize on this terrific opportunity. So they're making very concrete public policy choices in coordination with their business leaders in their state to make sure that the community college infrastructure there responds to stranded workers, right? This is, again, if we are intentional about this and we make it the priority we can make it, I have every confidence that we'll capitalize on this, given our ability to have capitalized on in the past.
And you have every confidence in it, speaking as an American, because some would say that the overarching narrative here is actually about societies in the East which are coping better and responding better to the challenge than societies in the West, like the American one. If one looks at relatively small states like Singapore and medium-sized states like South Korea, and then the vast power of China, one could say that right now they appear to be thinking more strategically, investing more coherent in their vision of a future of work for their populations than
I've heard the argument.
Societies like ours.
I've heard the argument. I saw, and I see the argument every day. And I am concerned about what appears to be a burgeoning crisis of confidence in the West and in the United States about our system. But I don't have that crisis.
You don't?
I do not.
You've got three kids. You're really confident that the U.S. economy is going to be in the right place to offer them, and not just them, because frankly they're privileged elite kids, because they are, let's face it, but the kids of people a little further down the food chain than you, that it is going to be an economy that offers them the right training, the right education, and then the right jobs.
I think the question is, in an agile, open, fast-moving, Moore's Law-based international economy, is the American system or the Chinese system better positioned to succeed? I think that history has shown us, and I think the future will show us, that an open, dynamic system like the United States succeeds in an open, dynamic system like this international economy. Is that going to be, foretold? No.
No, it's not.
But it's going to require urgency around these questions and intentionality around these questions of the type that we've just been talking about, and these guys have been talking about for the last day.
But fascinating that you posit the US as the open system and the Chinese one as less so, when of course right now in, for example, world trade discussions, China is the champion of open and free trade, and the United States is just the opposite.
I think that's a fair point until it comes to a question of. I think it's a fair point until it comes to a question of issues like intellectual property, right? And transparency of data, and transparency of investments, and the requirements to make the investments. And so, look, this is a very real decision point. And I thought Tom Friedman's column earlier this week in the New York Times, I think, tees it up pretty well, which is to say that we're well positioned, provided we're intentional about the decisions we make, to succeed in this. Look, this symposium has been going on for decades. And it used to be made in the context of a question of competition between the West and non-West, as defined at that time as the West and the Soviets. And it was important to have that debate then, and it's important to have this debate now.
Just a final question from me, and then we're gonna before lunch get some questions from everybody here. I am fascinated to have with me in the chair next to me a guy who has been at the heart of the White House machine for 4 years. I mean, that's what you were with Barack Obama. Chief of Staff is a hugely important job. But it seems to me it absolutely epitomizes what some believe is the handicap that Western policymakers have, which is that all politics in the West is tailored to the next election. It's the political cycle of you've got to win the next race, and it is all about 2 years, 4-year cycles. Whereas those guys in China, they're not thinking about 2-year cycles, they're thinking about 20-year cycles. Mm-hmm. Is that not, now that you've emerged from that hothouse, that sort of 24/7 world of running a White House, is that not a fundamental problem? Which I suppose, as I'm saying, is sort of a problem with democracy as we practice it in the West.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think that responsiveness to the electorate can be seen as limiting factor. It can be seen as the kind of the fundamental lifeblood of the system. But I think what's interesting is take a look at the new 2025 strategy by China, and do as several technologists in the West have done, and kind of line that up against the AI strategy that came out of the White House. And you'll see that those documents are very similar. And so you ask yourself, why is it that innovative strategies and solutions and policies on these big questions in the main are bubbling up in Western institutions? And I think it's because in a freer, more open, more combative, intellectual, educational, and political system, you're going to get more dynamism. The question I think you're asking is, if you can take those ideas and incubate them over a longer period of time, are you going to be in a better position to garner stability? Yeah. I think that what this technological revolution has demonstrated is fast movements, fast change yields great reward. And so I think we succeed in that system in a much better way.
I hear you, Dennis. I've got this vision in my head of Donald Trump in the White House at the moment, and I'm thinking of your description of the democratic system being open, fast, dynamic, intellectual, and then I'm thinking, yeah, but Donald Trump's in the White House. Anyway, that's enough of me and my pet issues. Let's get to...
I ask you to just envision for yourself a second, though, 50 different governors in 50 different states competing for access to major employers, major businesses like all the people in this room, and figuring out, for example, as they are right now in the competition over Amazon headquarters too, who is best positioned to give that opportunity to Amazon, and how are they competing? And increasingly, we're pushing them to compete on the strength of their workers, the preparedness of their system to turn out workers that have the skills that they'll need, not today and tomorrow, but in the next 10 to 20 years.
And that's the time frame you need to work.
That's the time you need to work. And by the way, in 10 to 20 years, we'll be beyond where we anticipate today we will be.
You bet. All right, hands up. Let's get some questions for Dennis before we break for lunch. You, ma'am, and then we'll go over there, but you first.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Angela. I'm a medical doctor from New Zealand, which is where apparently all the American billionaires are seeking refuge in our little paradise.
Yeah, they're in Minnesota.
Yeah, well, so I guess like they vote with their money in that case. But if we talk about the issue of the precariat and the income inequality that we see in America and everywhere else in the world, the problem is that democracy really isn't working. We don't really see the representation in our parliament, but also that the elephant in the room is the ears are heard by the businesses, and that's because the politicians have networks with these businesses. And what about all those people who are disadvantaged? How do we rebalance that, and what have you learned through your time in the White House? Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's an excellent question, and I think that that's reflective, I think, of some of the politics, Stephen, that you were calling out, which is that people feel that the politics has moved beyond them. And the answer, I think, is twofold. One is greater participation. We talked about this in a great session last night with many of the young leaders. In the United States, young leaders are super dynamic, super giving, super entrepreneurial, but it turns out too busy to vote, right? because about 20% of them vote, right? That democracy does not sustain itself. And the system does not run on cynicism. This is the story of Barack Obama, which is it runs on a belief in the system and a belief in the fact, the belief that you're part of the system. You can't both say that the system doesn't work and I'm not turning out. So let's, in the first instance, try if it works. And the way to try if it works is you vote. 1. 2, we need greater transparency. The influence of money on all of our politics, there's no doubt that that's too much, right? So the answer to that has got to be greater transparency. And in that regard, I think a free press is a principal asset to the United States. And the next asset is the dynamism and transparency that comes from technology, right? So are the problems considerable? Yes. Are they bigger than the system that we have in place to address them, i.e. democracy? No, provided we use it. Look, it's the worst system, but for all the others.
Well, I've heard that before. Right, as I go to the next question, just a quick one for yes or no answer. Do you see another Obama on the horizon right now in the US?
Oh, it depends on what you mean by another Obama.
Well, I mean, another man or woman capable of, as you described Obama, you know, reaching out, of delivering a politics that overcame cynicism.
Yes.
Who is it? We'd all love a name. I mean...
I'll give you one.
Yeah?
Tim Walz, who's running for governor of Minnesota. This is an unbelievably capable guy. National Guardsman, high school teacher, very accomplished leader.
Are you a Minnesotan?
I am.
Oh, well, there you go. Anyway, good. I'm gonna follow that name.
Yes.
I guess there's quite a few of us in the room might. I know there was a question over there, so stick your hand up and we'll get you the mic. Yeah, you, sir. Yeah, go on. You've got the mic.
Hello, it's Alexander from Canada. As your northern neighbors, we miss you. A big piece of the conversation around beyond work that's also in the headlines in the United States is migration, immigration, and refugee resettlement. So how do we reframe those conversations when we talk about beyond work to conversations around resiliency and ingenuity of new arrivals in various countries, such as the United States? Thank you.
Excellent question, and I think first of all we do it by lifting up what works, and I think that your government deserves a lot of credit for that. I met somebody just this morning by the name of Martin Katz who's doing a lot of work on this, and in Canada. But first is we lift up what works. Second is we don't forget what works, and that's particularly true in the United States. When you consider any number of remarkable cases of growth and opportunity in the United States, you'll see many of those are immigrants, even refugees. So we ought not lose focus on that. And then the third is we ought to start using data to rebut the dystopian predictions that really drive this debate so often. One is the data around what in fact has happened with refugees coming into different societies, whether that means impact on growth, whether that means impact on instability, or even, as has been bandied about in the United States, threats of further terrorism. We've not seen the data to bear those fears out. In fact, the data points the other way. And so we just have to keep making our argument about what works and what the experience shows us. And in the main, I think this will come back. In our country, we go through this all the time. It was the case for my grandparents, all 4 of whom were refugees, and all 4 of whom started in one enclave of South Boston, where they could only have a very select set of jobs. That's not the case for me, fewer than, 80 years later. So the question is, what is it about each of these experiences over time that's told a different story.
Now, we have a screen up here saying last question, but as soon as somebody says last question, it means I'm desperately inclined to ask one more, or at least get you guys to ask one more. And because...
Such a pot stirrer.
Yeah, I know, but the point is, we've got Denis McDonough here, and when are we going to get the chance to talk to him again? And, you know, we get lunch every day, so don't you agree we should have one? We should get... Yeah, thank you. So we're going to get one more question, and I want to go over here because I haven't been down to the back. So you, sir, you've got yes, wave your hand, you're the one. You got the lottery ticket for the last question.
Hello, I'm Johannes from Germany. I'm a PhD student.
Grüß dich.
You characterize the United States as an open system. What do you think of free college education?
Yeah.
He's got 3 kids who are about to go to college, so I guess he might be quite enthusiastic.
The idea's grown on me. Look, I like the idea, but the question isn't whether or not it's free. The question is who's paying, right? I think the German system is very admirable, and I have a lot of German friends, and these are some unbelievably capable people. And so, yeah, that appeals to me. I don't, and so let me stipulate further that maybe behind your question is, like, why wouldn't you try this in America? We tried a proposal in the Obama administration for free community college, which is basically both a feeder to four-year colleges as well as a feeder into the professional world. And there is a place, there's cities and even some parts of some states where that is working right now. And Chicago, for example, Mayor Emanuel has in place a free community college structure for high-performing high school students from that city, including, by the way, what we call dreamers. That is to say, young people who are brought to this country with their parents, or to our country with their parents, so they don't have legal status, but they've lived their whole life functionally in the United States. So this is working in places. But I think it's a long time before we'd get to free college, generally speaking. But I would use this question to make a different point, which is basically 3 in 10 Americans go to college and get a college degree. That means 7 in 10 Americans do not. So 3 in 10 is not enough, because the data tell us the thing that is most likely to increase economic mobility of an individual worker in the United States is a college degree. And if one thing is undercutting the vibrancy of our democracy right now, it's the sense of lack of mobility. So we need to grow the 3 in 10. Should it be 5 in 10? Should it be 7 in 10? It should surely be more than 3 in 10. One of the ways we do that is by getting better cost structure. Inflation in university costs in the United States is too high. But we also then have to make, for the 7 and 10, a bunch of new available options. And with technology, getting new entrants into that space should be much easier. There's a bunch of you in this room. And when we reform the labor market so that somebody can trade his skills in that marketplace much more transparently, those new entrants will be much more vibrant. And when they are, competition will be more aggressive and cost will come down. So we ought to focus not just on the 3 in 10, we got to focus on 10 of 10, and we got to focus on cost across the system. And at the end of the day, I don't know what the dollar or the euro per student in Germany is, but it's probably better in that public system than the dollar per student in the university system for the US. And we ought to be much more competitive and much more lean than we are in that space, and I hope we get there. But look, it's still the envy of many different students around the world love to come to the United States. That's a great asset for us, and that's one piece of immigration and the movement of people that I hope we do not lose.
Right. It's time for a mea culpa. I've been a bit of a rubbish timekeeper because I know there are still lots of questions in the room, and I'm afraid we just don't have time to get to them. But all I can say is it's my last appearance at this particular St. Gallen, so thank you so much for being at this session. Thank you for being a wonderful audience throughout, but most of all, do please give a very, very big thank you to Denis McDonough.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Good job, man. It was fun.